We are taught to trust the police because they deal in facts. They deal in evidence, ballistics, and the hard reality of the law. They are trained observers who don't panic, and they certainly don't believe in fairy tales. But what happens when the people we call for help come face to face with something that our reality says shouldn't exist? I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. Tonight, we are opening the case files on two of the most terrifying law enforcement encounters in history. We're traveling deep into the Kiamichi Mountains of Oklahoma, where a skeptical deputy found himself in the middle of a literal siege against a family. Then, we head to a lonely gravel road in upstate New York, where a routine patrol turned into a standoff with a creature that has haunted the region for decades. These aren't just stories, these are police reports from men who had everything to lose by telling the truth. Before we cross the police line, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Do you think these officers saw a monster or something else entirely? Now, let's get into tonight's stories. The Siege of Honobia. Tonight's story takes us to the deep, rugged backwoods of Oklahoma, to a place where the trees grow so thick they block out the sun, and where the silence of the forest isn't peaceful, it's predatory. This is the story of a family who just wanted a quiet life off the grid, and the veteran police officer who was forced to confront something that simply should not exist. To understand the sheer terror of what happened to Officer Laney Greer, you first have to understand the people who called him. The year was 2000. We are in Honobia, Oklahoma. Now, if you look at a map, Honobia is barely a speck. It sits deep in the Kiamichi Mountains in the southeastern part of the state. This isn't the flat, dusty Oklahoma you see in old westerns. This is a dense, vertical, hardwood forest. It is an ancient country. Living in the heart of this isolation was the Lowry family, Tim Lowry, his wife Michelle, and their children. Tim was a tough guy. He wasn't the kind of person who spooked easily. He was an outdoorsman, a guy who knew his way around a rifle and knew the sounds of the woods. He had moved his family out to this remote 5-acre property specifically to get away from the noise of the city. He wanted peace. He wanted to raise his kids where the air was clean and the neighbors were miles away. For the first few months, that's exactly what they got. It was paradise. But in early January of 2000, the paradise began to rot. It started with the feeling. You know that sensation you get when you're walking to your car in a dark parking lot and the hair on the back of your neck stands up? You can't see anyone, you can't hear anyone, but your primal brain is screaming, run. You are being hunted. Michelle began to feel that sensation every time she went out to hang laundry. Tim felt it when he was working on his truck. They would snap their heads around, expecting to see a bear or a cougar or maybe a trespasser. But there was never anything there, just the swaying of the pines and the shadows stretching across the yard. Then, the feeling turned into sounds. At first, it was subtle, strange whistles coming from the tree line. Not bird calls, these were complex, mimicking whistles. Then, wood knocks. Loud, rhythmic cracks, like a baseball bat hitting a telephone pole. Whack, pause, whack. Tim, being a rational man, assumed it was local kids. Maybe teenagers from the next town over are trying to scare the city folks. He'd grab his flashlight, walk to the edge of the property, and yell into the dark, telling them to get lost, or they'd be dealing with the barrel of his shotgun. But the dark never answered back. By mid-January, the pranksters escalated. One evening, the family was sitting down to dinner when a massive boom shook the entire cabin. Dust fell from the rafters, the plates rattled on the table. Tim leaped up, grabbed his gun, and ran outside. He expected to find that a car had hit the house, or a propane tank had exploded. Instead, he found a rock. But not just a rock, a boulder. It was the size of a basketball, lying on the porch. Tim looked up at the roof. The rock had been thrown with such force that it had struck the side of the house near the roofline and fallen. Now, let's do some physics here. To throw a 50-pound river rock 40 feet through the air with enough velocity to dent solid wood requires superhuman strength. A bear can't do that. A human can't do that. Tim felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He scanned the tree line with his light. That's when he smelled it. The smell is always the first warning in these stories. It hit Tim like a physical wall, a mixture of rotten eggs, sulfur, wet dog, and something metallic, like old blood. It was a stench so powerful it made his eyes water. He retreated inside and locked the door. That night, the Loweries didn't sleep. The rocks kept coming. Thud, thud, crash. For hours, something was pelting their home with stones ranging from pebbles to brick-sized chunks. This went on for nights. The Loweries were living in a war zone. They covered their windows with plywood. They slept in the center of the living room with firearms loaded. Tim called his friends, guys who were hunters, asking for help. They came over, sat guard for a night, heard the noises, smelled the smell, and then left, terrified, telling Tim he needed to get his family out of there. But Tim was stubborn. This was his land. He wasn't going to be chased off by rocks. Eventually, though, the psychological torture became too much. The things in the woods weren't just throwing rocks anymore. They were coming closer. The family could hear heavy, bipedal footsteps circling the house. They could hear heavy breathing at the doors. Tim finally did what he prided himself on never doing. He called the police. Enter Officer Laney Greer. Laney Greer was a LaFleur County Sheriff's deputy. Some accounts refer to him as a specific tactical officer or game warden associated with the investigation. But in the lore, he is the primary law enforcement witness. Laney was a no-nonsense, old-school officer. He had seen it all. Drug busts, domestic disputes, violent assaults. He dealt with facts, evidence, and the law. When the call came in about a family in Honobia claiming they were under siege by monsters or wood apes, Laney rolled his eyes. He didn't believe in Bigfoot. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in meth heads and poachers. He assumed the Loweries were either hallucinating from a gas leak, drunk, or dealing with some very persistent local criminals who were trying to scare them off the land to use it for illegal cultivation. Laney drove his cruiser up the winding dirt road to the Lowry property. It was late, well past dark. The fog had settled into the valleys of the Kiamichi Mountains, reducing visibility to almost nothing. When he arrived, he found the Lowry family in a state of absolute hysteria. Tim, a grown man who looked like he could wrestle a steer, was pale and shaking. Michelle was clutching the children. They were terrified. Laney listened to their story. He looked at the plywood on the windows. He looked at the massive collection of rocks that Tim had gathered, the evidence of the assault. Laney had to admit, the rocks were strange. There were hundreds of them. River stones that didn't belong in the immediate yard. Someone had to have carried them up from the creek specifically to throw them. All right, Laney said, adjusting his belt. I'll take a look around. If there's someone out there, I'll find them. Tim grabbed Laney's arm. Officer, please, don't go out there alone. These things, they aren't people. Laney gave him a reassuring nod, the kind you give to a child scared of the closet, and stepped out into the night. Laney Greer walked the perimeter of the cabin. He had his heavy maglite in one hand and his other hand resting near his service weapon. He was looking for boot prints, cigarette butts, trash, anything that would give away the position of the pranksters. He walked toward the wood line, about 40 yards from the house. The first thing he noticed was the silence. If you've ever been in the deep woods at night, you know it's noisy. Crickets, tree frogs, cicadas, wind, it's a cacophony of life. But as Laney stepped closer to the trees, the sound just died. It was as if someone had flipped a switch on the forest. The silence was heavy. It pressed against his eardrums. Laney stopped. He swept his flashlight beam across the trees. Left, right, center. Nothing but trunks and brush. Then he heard it. To his left, deep in the thicket, a sound. Snap. It was the sound of a heavy branch breaking. Not a twig, a branch. Laney spun and leveled his light. Sheriff's Department, come out with your hands up, he shouted. His voice echoed off the trees, sounding small and insignificant in the vastness of the dark. No answer. Then, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the air. It was so deep Laney could feel it in his chest. It sounded like a lion crossed with a diesel engine. Laney's skepticism began to crack. That wasn't a meth head. that wasn't a poacher. He took a step forward, trying to penetrate the darkness with his beam. And then, the impossible happened. About 30 yards away, a figure stepped out from behind a massive oak tree. Laney's brain tried to process what he was seeing. At first, he thought it was a man in a ghillie suit. But as the figure fully emerged into the halo of the flashlight, that theory disintegrated. The creature was standing on two legs. It was massive. Laney would later estimate it was at least 8 to 9 feet tall. It was covered in dark, matted hair that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But it was the width that terrified him. The thing was 4 feet wide at the shoulders. It had no neck. The head just sat directly on the trapezius muscles. Laney froze. His training kicked in, assessed the threat, identified the target, but there was no file in his brain for this. The creature stood perfectly still. It didn't cower. It didn't shield its eyes from the light. It stared right back at him. Laney could see the eyes. They weren't glowing red like in the movies. They were dark, intelligent, and predatory. They were set deep in a face that looked terrifyingly human, yet completely animal. For a solid 10 seconds, man and monster locked eyes. Laney's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized he was holding a .40 caliber pistol against something that looked like it could flip a pickup truck. He felt helpless. Then, the creature moved. It didn't run away in a panic. It turned its upper body with a fluid, terrifying grace and simply stepped back into the shadows. 1 second, it was there, a biological tank of a creature. In the next, it was gone. But it wasn't alone. As Laney backed away, keeping his light trained on the spot where the creature had been, he heard movement to his right, then to his left. The woods were alive with them. Laney Greer, the veteran officer, the skeptic, the tough guy, turned and walked very quickly back to the cabin. He didn't run because you don't run from predators, but he certainly didn't linger. When Laney got back inside, Tim Lowry took one look at the officer's face and knew. "You saw it, didn't you?" Tim asked. Laney didn't say anything for a moment. He was pale. He locked the door behind him and checked the deadbolt. "I saw something," Laney admitted. "Something big." That night, the siege intensified. With the officer inside, the creatures seemed to get more aggressive. The rocks rained down harder. There were slams against the walls that shook the pictures off the hooks. At one point, they heard the distinct sound of the creatures mimicking the family weird, garbled vocalizations that sounded like a distorted recording of human speech. Laney, realizing that his radio was patchy in the valley and that they were effectively trapped, went into tactical mode. He and Tim stood guard at the windows. There are rumors, and again, these are the parts of the story that get whispered about in the Bigfoot community, that shots were fired that night. Tim Lowry has stated in later interviews that he did shoot at the creatures. He claims he hit one. He described seeing one of the creatures attempt to enter a shed or flank the house, and he fired his rifle. He said the creature screamed a human-like scream of pain, and that other creatures swarmed in, not to attack, but to drag the wounded one away. Laney Greer witnessed the chaos. He witnessed the terror of a family being hunted in their own home. He witnessed the reality that we are not always at the top of the food chain. The sun eventually rose over the Kiamichi Mountains. The noises stopped. The creatures retreated into the deep hollows. Laney Greer left the property that morning a changed man. He filed a report, but what do you write? Suspect was 8 feet tall, hairy, and immune to intimidation? The Lowry family didn't stay much longer. They loved that land. It was their dream. But you can't live in a war zone. You can't raise children in a house where you have to sleep with a shotgun across your chest. They packed up and left the Siege of Honobia behind. But the story didn't disappear. The Siege of Honobia became a legend in Oklahoma. Officer Laney Greer didn't shy away from what he saw. In the years following, when investigators came to town, people investigating the Bigfoot phenomenon, Laney would talk to them. He put his reputation on the line. He would take them to the spot. He would look them in the eye and say, "I know what people think, but I know what I saw." He described the creature's anatomy with the precision of a police witness, the gait, the muscle structure, the intelligence. He validated the Lowry family's nightmare. So why is this story so terrifying? Because it wasn't a fleeting glimpse. It wasn't a shadow in the corner of the eye. It was a sustained, multi-day assault on a home, verified by a trained observer who had every reason to deny it. It forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question. If Laney Greer, a man trained to observe and report facts, saw a tribe of massive bipedal primates in the woods of Oklahoma in the year 2000, what else is out there watching us from the tree line right now? The Beast of Abair Road, upstate New York, the late summer of 1976. If you look at a map of New York State, way up in the northeast corner, right where the jagged jaw of the Adirondack Mountains meets the spine of Vermont, you will find a small town called Whitehall. It is a place that feels forgotten by time, a rugged little community carved out of dense, rolling forests and limestone cliffs. In the 70s, it was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where the police blotter was mostly filled with noise complaints, the occasional bar fight, or a deer hit by a truck on Route 4. But on a humid night in August, that sense of safety would be shattered forever by something that walked out of the tree line and into the headlights of a police cruiser. This story isn't about a camper with an overactive imagination. It isn't about a hiker who saw a shadow move in the corner of their eye. This story is about a trained observer, a man whose job was to deal with facts, evidence, and reality. His name was Brian Gosselin, and he was a police officer for the Whitehall Village Police Department. And what he saw that night would not only end his career in law enforcement, but would change the way the entire world looked at the quiet woods of the American Northeast. To understand why this encounter is so terrifying, you first have to understand the geography of Abair Road. Abair Road is not a main thoroughfare. Even today, it is a lonely, desolate stretch of gravel and dirt that winds its way through farmland and heavy, encroaching forest. In 1976, it was even more isolated. It was the kind of road that teenagers would drive down to drink beer or park with their girlfriends, specifically because they knew no one would bother them. It was pitch black. There were no streetlights. The only illumination came from the moon and the stars, and if it was a cloudy night, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. On the night of Tuesday, August 24th, 1976, Officer Brian Gosselin was starting what he thought would be a routine graveyard shift. He was a young, capable officer, respected by his peers. He knew the town inside and out. He knew the troublemakers, he knew the business owners, and he knew the roads. Around 11 p.m., Gosselin was patrolling the quiet streets of the village. The radio in his cruiser was mostly silent, just the low static hum of the dispatch channel. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of humidity that sticks your shirt to your back. It was a Tuesday, the sleepiest night of the week. Then the radio crackled, but it wasn't a call from dispatch. A car came tearing into the village, moving way too fast. Gosselin watched as the vehicle screeched to a halt near his cruiser. The doors flew open, and two young men stumbled out. They were frantic. They were waving their arms, shouting, their eyes wide, with genuine primal terror. Gosselin recognized them immediately. One of them was his own brother, Paul Gosselin. The other was a friend named Marty Paddock. Now, Brian knew his brother. Paul was a tough kid. He wasn't prone to hysterics. But as Brian stepped out of his cruiser to meet them, he saw that Paul was shaking, visibly shaking. His face was pale, drained of blood. Marty looked even worse. He looked like he was about to be sick. "You have to come," Paul stammered, pointing back toward the dark edge of town. "You have to come right now. There's something out there." Brian tried to calm them down. "Slow down," he said. "What happened? Was there an accident? Did you hit someone?" "No," Paul said, his voice cracking. "We saw something on Abair Road. It screamed at us. It's huge, Brian. It's absolutely huge." Brian listened as the two teenagers spilled out a chaotic story. They had been driving down Abair Road, looking for a place to hang out, when they heard a noise that they couldn't describe, a scream, but not a human scream. They said it sounded like a woman being murdered, mixed with the roar of a lion. They said they saw large, dark shapes moving in the field. Brian was skeptical. He was a cop, after all. His first thought wasn't monsters. His first thought was that maybe someone was playing a prank, or maybe a farmer's cow had gotten loose, or perhaps there was a bear. But the fear in his brother's eyes was real. Paul wasn't lying. He might be mistaken, but he wasn't lying. Okay, Brian said, sighing. Get in the car. Show me. Brian didn't call for backup immediately. He didn't want to clutter the radio with reports of monsters until he saw what was going on. He figured he would drive out there, shine his spotlight around, scare off a bear or a couple of pranksters, and then send the boys home to sleep it off. He got into his patrol car, a heavy American sedan with a V8 engine, and Paul and Marty piled in. Brian put the car in gear and headed toward the edge of town, turning onto the long, winding path that led to Abair Road. As they left the village lights behind, the darkness of the countryside swallowed them. The headlights of the cruiser cut a narrow tunnel through the night. The trees on either side of the road leaned in, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers overhead. The drive was silent. Paul and Marty were huddled in the back, staring out the windows, flinching at every shadow. Brian gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the road. He felt a creeping sense of unease, though he wouldn't admit it. The transition from the safety of the police station to the total isolation of Abair Road was jarring. They turned onto Abair Road. The pavement ended, and the tires crunched onto gravel. The car bounced slightly as they navigated the ruts. Where was it? Brian asked. Up ahead, Paul whispered. By the power lines. There's a field on the right. Brian slowed the cruiser to a crawl. He reached up and unhooked the spotlight mounted on the driver's side pillar. This was a powerful beam, capable of lighting up a suspect from 100 yards away. He clicked it on. The beam swept across the tall grass. It illuminated the gnarled trunks of oak and maple trees. It caught the reflection of a discarded beer can, but there was nothing there. Just an empty field bordered by a dense, impenetrable wall of forest. I don't see anything, Brian said, his voice calm. It was here, Marty insisted. I swear it was here. Brian drove a little further, inching the car forward. The gravel popped and hissed under the tires. The engine purred, a low rumble that seemed too loud in the stillness of the night. They reached a spot where the road widened slightly, bordered by a cornfield on one side and a steep embankment leading down to a creek on the other. Brian stopped the car. He rolled down his window. Listen, he said. Silence. Absolute heavy silence. The crickets, which had been chirping loudly back in town, were dead quiet here. The cicadas were silent. The birds were silent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. In the world of the outdoors, this is known as the predator effect. When a top-tier predator enters an area, the smaller animals go silent to avoid detection. Brian didn't know the term, but he felt the effect. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. I'm gonna take a look, Brian said. Don't, Paul said from the back seat. Brian, don't get out. Brian ignored him. He was a police officer. This was his job. He opened the door and stepped out into the humid night. The air smelled strange. It wasn't the smell of pine or cut grass. It was a musk. A pungent, rotting odor, like wet dog and garbage, but sharper. It hit him in the back of the throat. He drew his service revolver, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. He held his heavy flashlight in his left hand and the gun in his right. He swept the light across the road. Nothing. He walked to the front of the cruiser, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots. He swept the light toward the cornfield. The stalk stood 6 feet tall, a wall of green and brown. Nothing moved. He turned back to the car. See? Nothing, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Then, a sound came from the darkness. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a scream. It was a heavy thud. It sounded like a bowling ball being dropped onto the earth. Thump, then another. Thump. It was the sound of footsteps. But these were bipedal footsteps, heavy two-legged strides, and they were getting closer. Brian spun around, aiming his light toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness and hit the edge of the embankment, about 30 feet away. And there, standing at the edge of the tree line, caught in the harsh halo of the police spotlight, was a nightmare. It wasn't a bear. Brian had seen bears. Bears have snouts. Bears have round ears. Bears, when they stand up, look wobbly and uncertain. This thing was standing perfectly still, and it was standing perfectly upright. It was massive. It stood over 7 feet tall. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, easily 3 times the width of a human man. It was covered in dark, matted hair that looked black in the night, but might have been a deep reddish brown. But it was the face that froze Brian's blood in his veins. The creature had a flat face, no snout. It had high cheekbones and a heavy brow ridge that cast its eyes in shadow. But the eyes themselves, the eyes were glowing. Not glowing like a cat's eyes reflect light, but glowing with a deep crimson red luminescence. They were locked onto Brian. Brian stood there, his arm extended, his pistol pointed directly at the creature's chest. He was 30 feet away. At this range, he couldn't miss. He was a trained marksman. All he had to do was squeeze the trigger, but he couldn't move. His brain was trying to process what he was seeing. It was a cognitive dissonance, a mental conflict where the reality in front of you contradicts everything you know to be true. He knew monsters weren't real, but a monster was standing in front of him. The smell was overwhelming now. It rolled over him in waves, a stench of decay and wild musk that made his eyes water. The creature didn't roar, it didn't charge. It just stood there, staring at him. It brought its hands up, hands that were human-like, with 5 fingers, but massive and covered in dark skin, and it shielded its eyes from the spotlight, just like a human would. Inside the car, Paul and Marty were screaming, "Shoot it, Brian, shoot it!" But Brian didn't shoot. Years later, when asked why he didn't pull the trigger, Brian would say that he didn't feel like the creature was about to attack. He felt like it was observing him. He also said that it looked too human. It didn't look like an animal. It looked like a person, a very strange, very large person. And you don't shoot a person unless you have to. The standoff lasted for what felt like an hour, but was probably less than a minute. The creature lowered its hand. It made a low, guttural noise, a rumbling that Brian could feel in his own chest, vibrating through the air. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature turned its head. It looked down the road, then looked back at Brian. It turned its massive body and took a step back into the brush. It didn't run. It didn't panic. It simply turned and walked away. The sound of it moving through the woods was terrifying. Trees snapped. Not twigs, trees. Brian could hear branches the size of baseball bats cracking as the creature pushed through the dense undergrowth as if it were walking through cobwebs. The spell broke. Brian scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He threw himself into the driver's seat of the cruiser and slammed the door. He locked it. "Did you see it? Did you see it?" Paul was yelling. "I saw it," Brian whispered. He threw the car into reverse. He didn't even bother turning around. He floored the accelerator, backing the cruiser down Abair Road at dangerous speeds, gravel spraying everywhere, the engine roaring. He didn't stop until they hit the paved county road a mile away. When they got back to the station, the change in Brian Gosselin was apparent to everyone. He walked in, pale and shaken. He told his sergeant what he had seen. Now, in most precincts, a cop claiming to see a monster would be laughed out of the room. He'd be told to go home and sleep it off, or maybe asked how many beers he'd had before his shift. But the sergeant looked at Brian, looked at his shaking hands, and looked at the terrified teenagers. He knew Brian was a solid officer. He knew he wasn't prone to making things up. The sergeant authorized a return to the scene. Wait, what? They went back? Yes. That same night, within an hour, a caravan of police vehicles returned to Abair Road. This time, there were more officers. They had shotguns. They had more spotlights. They were ready for a fight. They arrived at the spot where Brian had seen the creature. The air was still thick with that awful smell. It lingered like a physical presence. They found the tracks. In the soft mud of the embankment where the creature had stood were footprints, but they weren't bear tracks. They were human-shaped footprints, 5 toes, a heel, and an arch. But they were enormous. They measured over 16 inches in length and were nearly 8 inches wide. The depth of the impression suggested a weight that defied logic, something weighing 400 or 500 pounds. The officers followed the trail into the woods. They found broken branches, thick limbs snapped cleanly off at a height of 7 or 8 feet, far higher than a deer or a man could reach. They found matted grass where something massive had bedded down, but the creature was gone. The story of the beast of Whitehall exploded. The next day, the newspapers picked it up. The New York Times, the Adirondack Daily Enterprise, and papers from all over the country. Whitehall, New York, became ground zero for Bigfoot hunters. People flooded the town. They camped out on Abair Road with coolers of beer and shotguns, hoping to bag a monster. Brian Gosselin's life was turned upside down. He was mocked by some, ridiculed by the press. The X-Files wouldn't air for another 15 years, so the idea of a respectable cop seeing a cryptid was treated as a joke by the mainstream media. But Brian never wavered. He never changed his story. Not one detail. He didn't try to sell movie rights. He didn't try to become a celebrity. He simply stated over and over again, "I know what I saw." The town of Whitehall eventually embraced the legend. Today, if you visit, you'll see Bigfoot statues. They have a Bigfoot festival. They even pass a local law declaring the Sasquatch a protected species within the village limits, making it illegal to hunt or kill one. But for Brian Gosselin, that night wasn't about festivals or tourism. It was about the moment when the world he thought he knew, a world of laws, order, and known biology, cracked open. There's a postscript to this story that makes it even stranger. Years later, Brian wrote a book about his experience. He spent decades researching the woods around Whitehall. He claims that the creature he saw that night wasn't alone. He believes there is a breeding population of these animals in the Adirondacks, living in the deep, inaccessible ravines where humans rarely tread. And on quiet nights, residents of Abair Road still report hearing things, strange screams, heavy footsteps, the feeling of being watched. So, if you ever find yourself driving through upstate New York, near the Vermont border, and your GPS tries to take you down a shortcut called Abair Road, maybe just keep driving on the highway, because there are things in those woods that don't answer to our laws, and they certainly don't care about your badge. Two veteran officers, miles apart, are both forced to question their reality. Whether it was the siege in the Oklahoma mountains or the glowing eyes on a lonely New York road, one thing is certain: sometimes the woods stare back. What do you think? Were these law enforcement professionals suffering from hysteria, or is there really a breeding population of something hidden in our national forests? Let me know your theory in the comments. If you enjoyed tonight's investigation, please hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries for more dives into the unknown. And if you have a story of your own, a creepy encounter, a glitch in reality, or something strange in the woods, I want to hear it. Send your experiences to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Until next time, stay safe out there.